At 0730 hours on November 1st, 1943, Lieutenant General Nathaniel Carver stood on the bridge of the command ship USS Huron, watching the coastline of Bougainville slowly materialize through the morning mist. Carver was 61, tall, stoic, with a scar across his left cheek from a shrapnel wound earned in the last war. He had commanded Marines at Guadalcanal, had watched men drown in surf, had heard screams echo through jungle canyons. He knew exactly what waited on fortified beaches. He knew the price of miscalculation, but this morning felt different. Before him lay Empress Augusta Bay, quiet, almost serene, as if nature itself had exhaled before the storm. In just 2 hours, 14,000 Marines from the 3rd Marine Division would pour ashore. They were young, some barely 20, some already hardened by New Georgia and Guadalcanal, but all of them were stepping onto a battlefield shaped by a monster looming just 250 miles to the northwest, Rabaul, Japan's South Pacific citadel. The irony was painful. Rabaul's immense garrison, over 110,000 soldiers, sailors, and airmen, existed for one purpose: to stop what Carver was about to do. Yet they weren't coming. They didn't even know where to strike. Carver tightened his grip on the railing as the Huron cut through the inlet. The officers around him murmured, pointing at the horizon, speaking in clipped, careful tones. The fog lifted just enough to reveal dense jungle rising from volcanic soil, lush, impenetrable, and hiding God knows what. Carver remembered Guadalcanal vividly, the heat that suffocated, the smell of rotting vegetation mixed with blood, the bunkers that refused to die unless a flamethrower kissed them first. Every objective on the Solomon chain had bled men white for ground, barely big enough to draw on a map. Tarawa would prove it again. Just 3 weeks later, 3,000 casualties on an island 2 miles long. But Tarawa was a sandbar. Rabaul was an armored continent. For 20 months, Japanese engineers had carved tunnels deep into the volcanic rock, hollowing out entire mountainsides. The base was so vast that Allied intelligence joked you could lose an army in there and never find it again. Underneath the jungle canopy were underground hospitals, barracks for 20,000 men, fuel reservoirs sealed in caverns, ammunition dumps connected by rail tracks, and command posts buried so deep that no bomb could realistically reach them. Above ground, 5 airfields, Lakunai, Vunakanau, Rapapo, Tobera, and Karavat, formed a steel halo around Simpson Harbor. They had revetments for over 400 aircraft, including the heaviest twin-engine bombers in Japan's arsenal. 367 anti-aircraft guns waited for any attacker. 43 coastal guns guarded every potential landing beach. 6,000 machine guns, dug into pillboxes and spider holes, watched approach routes with unblinking malice. If Tarawa was a nightmare, Rabaul was the apocalypse. Every strategic paper since early 1942 had pointed to the same objective: take Rabaul, break Rabaul, own the South Pacific. General Douglas Tremaine in Washington called it the hinge of Japan's outer defensive arc. Admiral Porter Haynes referred to it as the primary American responsibility of 1943. Operation Cartwheel, the great Allied pincer movement across the Solomons and New Guinea, had been designed for one purpose: surround, invade, and capture Rabaul no later than March 1944. But when planners laid the maps across their tables and traced the coastline with trembling fingers, doubts grew. Capturing Rabaul, they realized, might cost more American lives than any battle since the Civil War. The Japanese were learning from every disaster they had suffered. They'd adapted their defenses, camouflaging artillery with nets and palm fronds, burying fuel tanks, shifting aircraft between decoy airstrips, tunneling deeper, wider, further. They knew America had naval gunfire and air superiority, so they built defenses meant to swallow both. And the terrain itself? A nightmare made of mud, humidity, and disease. In New Guinea, American and Australian soldiers had suffered more from sickness than bullets. malaria shaking entire companies into delirium, dengue fever burning men with 104-degree temperatures, dysentery turning strong bodies into hollow shells. Tropical ulcers, terrifying, flesh-eating infections spread from the smallest scratch. At Buna and Gona, two villages defended by just 6,500 Japanese troops, took 3 months and over 3,000 Allied casualties to capture. If 2 villages cost 3 months, what would it take to storm 5 airfields to WW2, a fortified port, and 110,000 defenders? The math was merciless. In mid-1943, intelligence analysts reached a chilling consensus. A Rabaul invasion would require 60,000, 75,000 assault troops and produce 18,000 casualties in the first 2 weeks alone. And that was assuming no storms, no reinforcements from Truk, and no failed naval bombardments. And then came the story that haunted the planning rooms, the loss of Brigadier General Harrison Locke, an airman whose charisma masked a relentless belief in the power of strategic bombing. Locke, commander of the 5th Bomber Group, had been one of the great evangelists of the Air Corps Tactical School. He believed almost religiously that air power could break any fortress if used correctly. Rabaul was his ultimate test. He flew his first strike in September 1942. It achieved nothing. He flew again, and again, and again, until January 5, 1943, when he ignored orders for a dawn approach and delayed the attack until midday, insisting that his bombers needed the light to form properly. 12 bombers entered the sky above Simpson Harbor, the most dangerous airspace in the Pacific, at high noon. The Japanese were waiting. Anti-aircraft fire shredded the formation. Fighters from 3 airfields swarmed. Locke's B-17, Silver Marlin, took hits immediately. Smoke poured from the Nober 3 engine. Still, he pressed on, guiding his formation through a wall of tracers. His bombardier hit 2 transports in the harbor. Then a dozen Zeros fell upon the lead bomber like predators sensing blood. Witnesses saw Silver Marlin drop altitude, trailing smoke, disappearing into cloud. It never came out. Locke's body was never found. He became the highest-ranking American officer still missing in the South Pacific. His Medal of Honor citation praised his courage, but did not mention what everyone already knew. Rabaul could not be neutralized by bombing alone. And yet the ground campaign was even worse. From Nassau Bay to Salamaua, from Nadzab to Leh, the Allied advance in New Guinea had been a slog through hell weeks becoming months, objectives that looked simple on maps becoming death traps in reality. If taking one airstrip cost 400 casualties, taking all of Rabaul's would drain armies. The numbers didn't just look bad, they looked impossible. And so, as Carver stared toward the shore of Bougainville that misty morning, he knew the truth, gnawing at every planner, every commander, every man who'd seen what the Japanese could do when cornered. There had to be another way. He just didn't know yet that the battle for Bougainville would provide the answer. A strategic idea older than the war itself. A concept that would change everything. A decision that would defeat Rabaul without ever storming its beaches. The first American commander to die trying to break Rabaul had been Brigadier General Harrison Locke. But he was not the last to discover that the fortress was unlike anything the Allies had faced. The next to challenge it was a man whose courage sometimes verged on reckless brilliance, Major Raymond H. Calder, commanding officer of the 9th Bombardment Squadron. By October 1943, the Allies finally had airfields close enough on Kirawina, Dobodura, and Guadalcanal to mount sustained operations against Rabaul. General George Kearns, successor to Locke, planned a massive strike for October 12th. 349 aircraft, the largest air assault the Southwest Pacific had yet launched. B-24 Liberators, B-25 Mitchells, P-38 Lightnings, A-20 Havocs, and Australian Beaufighters. Everything that could fly would fly. At the briefing, Calder stood with his hands on his hips, chewing a stick of gum with the calmness of a man about to bet his life on a coin toss. "Gentlemen," Kearns said, sliding intelligence photos across the table, "today, we knocked the teeth out of Rabaul." Calder leaned toward a young pilot trembling at the back. "Relax, kid," he whispered. "Rabaul chews loud, but she doesn't bite everyone, just the unlucky ones." The briefing room erupted in nervous laughter. At dawn on October 12th, the sky over New Guinea filled with aircraft. Engines roared like a rising storm. The armada climbed toward Rabaul, sunlight glittering off endless aluminum wings. Kearns was confident, too confident. When the bombers reached their targets, the airfields were battered, fuel tanks burst, flames blooming across revetments. Reports came in. 70 aircraft destroyed on the ground, runways cratered, fuel depots burning. The press releases practically wrote themselves. MacArthur sent congratulatory messages. Newspapers in Sydney and San Francisco published headlines proclaiming Rabaul neutralized. It was all wrong. The Japanese had moved most of their fuel underground weeks earlier. Many of the destroyed planes were decoys or aircraft already grounded, awaiting repair. Intelligence would later reveal that fewer than 20 operational aircraft were actually lost, but the pilots didn't know that yet. Major Calder flew his damaged B-25 back to base, with holes stitched across his fuselage like a metal scar. He climbed down, wiped sweat and engine grease from his face, and muttered to a mechanic, "Rabaul's laughing at us." 3 weeks later, on November 2nd, the Allies returned this time with a daring low-level attack. 72 B-25 seconds and 80 P-38 seconds would roar straight into Simpson Harbor at wave-top height. The mission was so dangerous that one navigator described it as volunteering to fly into a volcano. The pilots didn't know it yet, but the Japanese had reinforced Rabaul the day before with 173 elite carrier aircraft pilots from the very decks of Zuikaku, Shokaku, and Zuiho, men trained for naval combat, now shielded by the jungle fortress. The American formation approached the harbor just after sunrise. The ocean glimmered silver beneath them. Then the first tracers screamed upward, red-orange streaks tearing through the air like flaming arrows. The sky transformed into chaos. Anti-aircraft guns thundered from ships and shore. Puffs of black smoke tore open around the B-25 seconds. Japanese fighters dove in from above, weaving through clouds like steel serpents. Pilots later said the noise, the rattling, the explosions, the engines straining was so loud it felt like the world was cracking open. Major Calder led his squadron in. He flew so low his propellers kicked up spray from the harbor. "Keep it tight," he yelled into the intercom, voice steady despite the firestorm. Bombs tumbled from open bays. 2 Japanese transports erupted in flames. A destroyer split apart in a tower of smoke. Calder's radio crackled. "Major, we're hit." Before the voice finished, a Zero streaked past Calder's cockpit, firing a burst that stitched across his wing. His aircraft shuddered, oil splattering across the windscreen. Still, he pressed forward, hoping to draw fire from the men behind him. But fate was cruel that morning. A heavy-caliber round pierced Calder's fuselage. Flames licked the engine. The bomber yawed, struggled, then rolled onto its side and plunged toward the sea. Survivors saw it strike the water and vaporize in a white plume. Calder never surfaced. He was one of over 60 men lost that day. The raid damaged Japanese vessels, yes, but Rabaul remained alive, enraged, unbroken, and American commanders were forced to admit what they feared. Rabaul could not be destroyed by bombing, and it could not be taken by landing forces. Meanwhile, on the New Guinea front, the jungle was killing as many men as the Japanese. Columns fighting from Buna to Leh and from Salamaua to Finschhafen reported the same horrors. Sweat that soaked uniforms within minutes. Mosquitoes so thick they sounded like static. Mud that swallowed boots. Vines that snagged rifles. Fevers that left grown men sobbing. Japanese snipers who disappeared like ghosts. At Nadzab, American paratroopers of the 503rd Regiment made a risky daylight jump to seize the airfield. The mission succeeded, but advancing beyond the airstrip became agony. The Japanese 51st Division refused to collapse. Every ridge became a miniature hell. Every river crossing took hours of skirmishing. One Australian sergeant wrote in his diary, "You don't fight the Japanese here, you fight the jungle. The Japanese just wait until you're too tired to lift your rifle." 2 weeks of operations cost the Australians over 400 casualties. Japanese casualties were higher, but many escaped to fight again at their next stronghold. No matter how often the Allies pushed, the Japanese seemed to slip backward, regroup, and prepare another defense deeper in the mountains. It became obvious. If this grinding advance continued toward Rabaul, the Allied armies would bleed out long before reaching the fortress. By late 1943, Allied planners gathered casualty charts in piles as thick as telephone books. They calculated and recalculated. Troops required. Ships required. Months required. Casualties expected. Every time, the answer was the same. Too many. Too long. Too costly. To assault Rabaul would require ripping divisions away from Europe, delaying the cross-channel invasion, and sabotaging the Allied timetable. Rabaul was a wall, and running headfirst into it would shatter every plan the Allies had. There had to be another way. And then, quietly from a stack of forgotten theoretical documents written decades earlier, an idea resurfaced. Not brilliant, not glamorous, not heroic in the traditional sense, but revolutionary. An idea proposed in 1921 by a Marine major few remembered. The man was Major Ellis Harwood, and in the interwar years he had written a strange but far-sighted analysis. If Japan scattered its defenses across islands, America should not fight for every island. It should bypass most of them, seal them off, let them rot. At the time, his ideas were considered eccentric, even dangerous. But in 1943, with Rabaul looming and casualties rising, the Joint Strategic Survey Committee dusted off Harwood's old papers. They began asking new questions. Why take a fortress if you can starve it? Why bleed for ground that has no value once isolated? Why fight the garrison at all if you can turn it into a prison? The idea gathered momentum, and the first major figure to support it quietly, rationally, relentlessly was General Robert Mallory Marshall, the U.S. Army Chief of Staff. Marshall wasn't a man easily swayed by emotion. He looked at numbers, logistics, ratios. He saw the Pacific not as a map filled with arrows and objectives, but as a calculator filled with equations. And Rabaul's equation was fatal. Marshall told his advisors, "Gentlemen, if Rabaul costs us 30,000 casualties to take, then it is not worth taking because we can defeat it without touching it." His voice was steady, but the room felt the tremor of a radical shift. That shift would soon transform the entire war. General Robert Mallory Marshall would later say that the Rabaul decision was one of the most important of the entire Pacific War. But in mid-1943, the idea of bypassing such a massive fortress still felt like heresy. Rabaul had dominated strategic thinking for almost 2 years. It was the gravitational center of every plan, the shadow hanging over every operational map. To not capture it felt, at first, like surrender. And no one embodied that resistance more than General Douglas Hale, MacArthur's operations chief in the Southwest Pacific. Hale was brilliant, fiercely loyal to MacArthur, and possessed a rigid belief that great enemies demanded great battles. He argued that leaving Rabaul in the rear was like leaving a wolf alive behind the sheepfold. He believed the Japanese would use Rabaul to strike supply lines, launch raids, or rally for a counteroffensive. But Marshall was relentless. He saw a fortress too big to kill and too big to matter once isolated. Behind closed doors in Washington, the Joint Strategic Survey Committee finally put words to the thought few dared to voice. Rabaul may be made strategically irrelevant without direct assault. The language was clinical, almost timid, but the implications were seismic. In Brisbane, General Edwin Kenyon, commander of the 5th Air Force, reached the same conclusion for entirely different reasons. Kenyon was a short, round man, with a voice like gravel, and a brain that worked like a gun sight, fast, precise, deadly. He had watched squadron after squadron get ripped apart over Simpson Harbor. He had buried too many pilots. One evening in July 1943, Kenyon walked into MacArthur's headquarters carrying a stack of reconnaissance photos. His uniform was wrinkled, his eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep. He slapped the photos on MacArthur's desk. "Sir," he said, "we can hit Rabaul every day for a year and it'll still be there. But if we get fighters on Bougainville," he tapped one photo, "right here, at Torokina, they'll be within 250 miles. Close enough for daily sweeps, close enough for interdiction, close enough to starve the place." MacArthur didn't respond at first. He sat stiffly, hands clasped, the weight of the Pacific pressing down on his shoulders. Kenyon pushed harder. "We don't need to take Rabaul," he said. "We only need to make it useless." MacArthur frowned. "And what will the press say? What will Washington say?" "My entire operational plan has been oriented toward Rabaul for a year," Kenyon replied softly. "They'll say you saved 20,000 American lives." MacArthur stared out the window for a long moment, watching the Brisbane River shimmer under the afternoon sun. Then he exhaled, slow, grudging, but decisive. "Draw up the contingency plan," he said. And the war began to pivot. Meanwhile, Admiral William Halsey, commander of the South Pacific area, was already testing the bypass concept on the battlefield. He had spent months fighting through the Central Solomons, losing ships to Japanese torpedoes, losing Marines to malaria, losing patience with island hopping that felt like trying to climb a mountain by counting pebbles. In August 1943, instead of attacking the heavily fortified island of Kolombangara, Halsey made a radical decision. He ignored it entirely and landed troops on Vella La Vella, a lightly defended island farther north. His staff protested. Intelligence analysts warned of risk. Traditional doctrine insisted that major enemy positions must be reduced before moving forward. Halsey shrugged. "We're not here to impress textbooks," he said. "We're here to win." The operation succeeded brilliantly. By the time the Japanese realized what was happening, American engineers were already carving an airfield out of jungle. Kolombangara's garrison, built for a grand showdown, sat useless, cut off, bypassed, irrelevant. 6 weeks later, the Japanese evacuated the island under cover of night. Halsey had proven that bypassing worked not just in theory, but in blood and sweat and real combat. In August 1943, the Allied High Command gathered in Quebec for the Quadrant Conference. Prime Minister Churchill arrived wrapped in layers of cigar smoke and rhetorical flourish. President Roosevelt came with his calm, inscrutable smile. Alongside them were the greatest military minds of the Allied world: Marshall, King, Arnold, Brooke. But one question overshadowed all others. What should be done about Rabaul? On August 19th, Marshall presented his case. He spoke with the precision of a surgeon and the authority of a man who had calculated the cost of war far too many times. He displayed maps of Rabaul's airfields, photographs of its tunnel networks, casualty estimates for amphibious assault. His voice remained steady. To take Rabaul would require diverting forces from Europe. To attack it directly would cost tens of thousands of lives. To bypass it would cost far fewer and achieve the same strategic effect. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't dramatize. He didn't need to. The numbers spoke for themselves. Admiral Ernest King, arrogant, brilliant, and famously allergic to cooperation, stood and surprised nearly everyone in the room. "I agree with General Marshall," he said bluntly. "The Navy cannot support both the Central Pacific Drive and a Rabaul invasion. We must choose, and the wise choice is to bypass." Silence filled the chamber. Then Brigadier General Hale rose to speak, representing MacArthur's interests. Hale argued that bypassing Rabaul would leave a dagger pointed at the Allied flank. He insisted the garrison could threaten supply lines. He warned that leaving such a fortress untouched will embolden the enemy. Marshall looked Hale in the eyes and asked, "General, how many Marines is Rabaul worth? 20,000? 40,000? Give me the number." Hale's mouth opened, but no answer came. Because there was no answer that made sense. Field Marshal Alan Brooke, chief of the British Imperial General Staff, leaned back and said dryly, "It seems plainly foolish to lose men capturing positions we do not actually need." Churchill nodded. Roosevelt nodded. The momentum shifted. On August 24th, the combined chiefs issued their ruling. Rabaul would not be invaded. It would be neutralized, isolated, starved, ignored. The decision was final, and it changed the Pacific War forever. The directive reached MacArthur's Brisbane headquarters on September 17th. His staff stood tense as he read the message. This man who had built his reputation on relentless offensives, on retaking the Philippines, on grand tactical gestures. The order effectively erased a year's worth of planning, logistics, training, and preparation. For several minutes, MacArthur said nothing. His fingers tapped rhythmically on his desk. Then, with surprising calm, he turned to his chief of staff, General Richard Sutherland. "Begin the replanning," he said. "Our new objective is the Philippines. Rabaul is no longer to be assaulted." He paused. "Very well. Then we shall beat Japan another way." His pride was wounded, but his ambition adapted. If the Joint Chiefs wanted bypassing, he would bypass on a grand scale, leapfrogging thousands of miles, isolating whole Japanese armies, racing toward Manila. Rabaul, once the prize of all prizes, became a ghost on the map. And the first real test of that strategy began on the morning we left Lieutenant General Nathaniel Carver standing on the bridge of USS Huron as his Marines prepared to land at Bougainville. The fate of Rabaul and the fate of Japan's South Pacific Empire would be decided not by storming the fortress, but by ignoring it. The new Allied strategy, bypass, isolate, neutralize, would face its first true test on the volcanic shores of Bougainville. At dawn on November 1st, 1943, the Marines stormed the beaches at Empress Augusta Bay. This time, Rabaul's massive garrison could not interfere. They tried scrambling cruisers from Truk, launching air raids from their labyrinth of airfields, but the Allies were already evolving faster than Japan could react. 3 days after the landings, Admiral Frederick Coleman Sharp, commander of Task Force 38, arrived within striking distance of Rabaul. Sharp was 58, a naval aviator since biplane days, respected for his calm under pressure. He knew perfectly well that what he was about to attempt bordered on madness. Launching carrier aircraft against a heavily fortified land base, bristling with hundreds of anti-aircraft guns. But Admiral Halsey's orders were clear. Hit the Japanese fleet at Rabaul before it can steam toward Bougainville. On the morning of November 5th, Sharp's 2 carriers, Saratoga and Princeton, launched 97 aircraft. The planes roared into the sky like a swarm of steel hornets. Dauntless dive bombers, Avenger torpedo bombers, and Hellcat fighters climbed into sunlight and banked north across open sea. The pilots knew Rabaul's reputation. Many had seen reconnaissance photos showing the dense ring of anti-aircraft guns around Simpson Harbor. Some had listened to radio chatter of previous bomber crews, terrified voices swallowed by static and gunfire. But they went anyway, because Bougainville depended on them, because the new strategy depended on them, and because, deep down, every man wanted to prove that the fortress everyone feared could bleed. When the American strike group arrived over Simpson Harbor, they found the Japanese cruiser force anchored below 7 heavy cruisers, resting in the calm blue water like sharks preparing for the hunt. Then the attack began. Dive bombers shrieked downward through exploding flak. Torpedo bombers skimmed the water, launching their payloads at terrifyingly close range. Hellcats tangled with Japanese Zeros above the harbor, twisting and clawing in a ballet of smoke and fire. The entire strike lasted only 18 minutes. When the American aircraft turned for home, 6 of the 7 Japanese cruisers were damaged, some severely. One ship's engine room was obliterated. Another's deck was splintered by a direct hit. Fires burned across the harbor. Sharp lost 9 aircraft. But he had done what no one thought possible. He struck the heart of Rabaul and lived. Naval historians would later call it Pearl Harbor in reverse. 1 hour after Sharp's strike, B-24 Liberators from Kenyon's 5th Air Force arrived with P-38 escorts and pummeled the harbor again, adding to the devastation. Rabaul's cruisers limped away to Truk. The Japanese Navy would never again send heavy surface ships to Rabaul. Without that naval support, the giant fortress lost its ability to strike outward. Its claws were clipped, and the Bougainville landing was secured. Within 3 weeks, the Marines carved an airfield out of the swamps of Bougainville. By early December, fighters were launching daily raids on Rabaul. For the first time, the Japanese felt the pressure not from faraway bombers, but from aircraft rising just a short flight away. On December 15th, Major General Arden Greeley arrived to take command of the 1st Marine Amphibious Corps. Greeley was 58, an early Marine aviator who had flown wood and canvas planes in World War I. He understood air power instinctively and knew how to wield it aggressively. Under his direction, the Bougainville airfields became engines of destruction. Every morning, American fighters swept over Rabaul, hunting anything that tried to take off. Every night, B-24 seconds cratered runways and cratered them again. The Japanese repaired them, but it no longer mattered because they could never keep them open long enough to regain air superiority. By January 1944, Rabaul was being smothered. On December 26th, Marines landed at Cape Gloucester on New Britain's western tip. The operation secured the strait between New Guinea and New Britain. Rabaul attempted to reinforce the garrison, but American submarines sank 2 of 3 transports. The third turned back. Cape Gloucester fell with minimal casualties. The bypass strategy was not just working, it was accelerating the entire war. By February 1944, Rabaul was encircled on all sides by Allied airfields Bougainville, Cape Gloucester, and soon the Green Islands. Its 110,000 troops could do nothing but watch as fuel dwindled, supplies dried up, and the skies above them belonged entirely to the enemy. And the rest of the Pacific watched, too. Admiral Chester Matson, commander of the Central Pacific, studied the results from Rabaul and immediately applied them to the Marshall Islands. Instead of attacking the heavily fortified bases of Wocha or Maloelap, he bypassed them. Instead of spending thousands of lives, he seized lightly defended Kwajalein and Eniwetok. The Japanese garrisons, built for dramatic showdowns, became prisoners of their own concrete. In New Guinea, MacArthur adopted the same logic with newfound zeal. He bypassed the Japanese strongholds at Madang and Wewak and leapt hundreds of miles west to Hollandia, leaving entire Japanese armies stranded behind the front, unable to escape, unable to intervene. The numbers spoke louder than any speech. In the 12 months before the Rabaul bypass, 15,000 Allied casualties in the Southwest Pacific. In the 12 months after, fewer than 8,000. Despite covering far more territory, the Japanese began to understand, slowly, then suddenly, that their mighty defensive perimeter meant nothing. That their fortresses were traps not for the Allies, but for themselves. That the Americans no longer needed to kill Japanese soldiers to defeat them. They only needed to go around them. Inside Rabaul, Vice Admiral Kazuo Tanigawa, commander of the Southeast Area Fleet, waited for the invasion he had trained for since 1942. He had overseen every tunnel, every airfield expansion, every bunker reinforcement. He had planned for firestorms, naval bombardments, desperate last stands. He had never planned for silence. By February 1944, Tanigawa watched American bombers come and go, watched ships sail past without approaching, watched Japanese aircraft rust beneath tarps. He wrote in his diary, "We prepared to give our lives, but the enemy refuses to take them." The garrison planted gardens. They raised chickens. They fished. They rationed. They starved. By war's end, of the 110,000 men once stationed at Rabaul, only about 69,000 soldiers and 20,000 civilian workers remained alive. More than 20,000 had died not by bullets, but by starvation and disease. Rabaul, once the mightiest fortress in the South Pacific, had become an island-sized prison. When the war was over, the world remembered the great battles: Midway, Guadalcanal, Saipan, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. But no medals were awarded for Rabaul's bypass. No ceremonies honored the decision that saved tens of thousands of lives. General Robert Mallory Marshall went on to serve as Secretary of State, win the Nobel Peace Prize, and reshape Europe through the Marshall Plan. In interviews, he said quietly, "Bypassing Rabaul saved more lives than any battle we might have fought." General Edwin Kenyon retired in 1951. Admiral Halsey became a national icon. Admiral Sharp wrote a memoir describing the Rabaul carrier strike as the riskiest operation I ever commanded, and the one that proved carriers could strike any target on Earth. Vice Admiral Tanagawa survived the war and lived quietly in Kamakura until his death in 1972. He titled his memoir, Waiting at Rabaul. He wrote, "The worst fate for a soldier is not to die in battle. It is to train for death and never be allowed to spend it." Today, Rabaul's tunnels still exist. Dark, silent, swallowed by vines and volcanic ash. The runways are cracked and overgrown. The harbor is calm, hiding rusted skeletons of ships beneath the waves. Tourists visit the memorials for Australian defenders and Allied airmen, but there are no plaques for the Japanese garrison that wasted away in those tunnels. None for the Joint Strategic Survey Committee that first suggested bypassing. None for the thousands who lived because a battle never happened. History remembers the fights we win. It rarely remembers the ones we choose not to fight. But sometimes, not fighting is the greatest strategic victory of all. And that is how 110,000 Japanese soldiers waiting in the strongest fortress of the Pacific were defeated not by invasion, but by irrelevance.